Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. If you are studying IBDP history, or honestly, if you just love unpacking massive, complex historical puzzles, you are in exactly the right place. Today we're tackling a really huge historiographical investigation. We're looking at the multi-causal nature of Norse expansion between the 9th and 11th centuries.
So what actually drove the Norsemen out of Scandinavia? For the longest time, pop culture has just leaned into this super simplistic myth of the bloodthirsty Viking raider, right? Just sailing out purely for gold and chaos. But as historians, well, we know history is rarely that simple. The true story is actually a fascinating interlocking puzzle of economics, politics, and raw survival.
Okay, let's dive into this. To solve this puzzle, we really need a solid analytical framework. So we're going to categorize our evidence into two distinct forces: push factors and pull factors. Push factors are basically the internal domestic pressures within Scandinavia that effectively forced people away from their homes. Pull factors, on the other hand, are the external overseas opportunities that actively drew them towards specific shores. Understanding this push-pull dynamic is absolutely crucial when you're evaluating historical causation.
Here is a quick roadmap for what we're covering. We'll hit 1. The expansion phenomenon itself. 2. Domestic push factors of land and demographics. 3. Push factors concerning politics and status. 4. External pull factors like wealth and vulnerable targets. 5. Ideological friction. And finally, evaluating their significance. This thematic structure is essentially the perfect cognitive scaffolding for a Peel-style essay, allowing you to mentally map out your arguments as we go along.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the expansion phenomenon. We are talking about scaling the globe.
First, we just have to appreciate the sheer massive scale of what we are analyzing here. Tracing the timeline really shows how these intersecting domestic and external events created the absolute perfect storm. We go from the fragmentation of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to early demographic shifts in centralizing kings in the 8th century, all the way to the absolute explosion of overseas expansion in the 9th century. We are talking about a geographical footprint that stretched from Vinland in modern-day Canada down to Rome and deep through the river systems of Russia all the way to Baghdad. That is staggering.
Moving right along to Section 2, push factors, specifically land, demographics, and the survival catalyst.
So a massive push factor was quite simply survival. Scandinavia at this time was experiencing a booming population, but it was paired with an acute, severe shortage of fertile arable land. Insights from medieval texts, like the Landnama book, reveal a really stark reality. Think about this. Missing just a single season of making hay could literally mean the total starvation of your livestock over a harsh winter. It just shows you the severe agricultural fragility of these early settlements. They had to rely on super strict legal codes just to manage pasture land, calculating exact livestock quotas to prevent catastrophic overgrazing.
Now, what's really interesting here is how we can model complicating this purely economic argument. Yes, for sure, the desperate search for arable land drove migrants to favorable, warmer climates like the UK and Ireland to grow vital cereal crops. However, consider the Greenland anomaly. The Norse willingly settled a notoriously hostile, freezing environment that was utterly unsuited for traditional farming. So this anomaly proves to us that a basic shortage of farmland wasn't the only factor driving this massive expansion.
Economic survival was huge, but it wasn't the only pressure cooker. That brings us to Section 3, politics, status, and fleeing the crown.
Between the 8th and 11th centuries, the political landscape in Scandinavia was shifting incredibly fast. We see the rise of powerful, consolidated kings, guys like King Harald Fairhair in Norway, and they were actively eliminating the traditional autonomy of regional chieftains. For a lot of these aristocratic Norsemen, submitting to a centralized crown meant becoming a mere servant or a hireling, which completely violated their deep cultural codes of honor. So migrating wasn't always just about being poor and hungry. Take someone like Ingolf Arnarsson, who fled blood feuds to become the first permanent settler of Iceland. For families like his, exile essentially became an engine of exploration. It was a highly honorable choice to maintain your family's independence and status against royal tyranny.
Okay, let's flip the script and look outward. Section 4, pull factors. We're looking at wealth and the lure of unprotected targets.
There is a really fascinating social dynamic at play here. 8th century Scandinavia actually suffered a major demographic bride shortage. And this was made way worse by elites practicing polygyny, basically taking multiple wives. So what happens? You get an entire generation of lower status young men pushed completely out of the marriage market. The effect is that raiding became this incredibly swift way to accumulate wealth or abduct captives.
Slavery, or the taking of thralls, was completely foundational to their economy. Captives were funneled through Dublin and down Russian rivers all the way to Byzantium. And the proof for this is literally in our DNA. Modern genetic studies reveal that a significant majority of historical Icelandic women share Scottish and Irish ancestry, which directly backs up the accounts we read in the sagas.
You also kind of got to understand that Norse society was an open, hyper-competitive system. Wealth wasn't just something you stuffed in a chest to gather dust, it was a tool. In this gift exchange economy, chieftains constantly redistributed looted silver and gold to secure loyalty and forge alliances. Wealth was literally worn as a status symbol. Foreign observers at the time noted that Rus women, those are Norse women living in the East, wore heavy gold and silver neck chains, and the exact number of chains directly correlated to their husband's financial success. So a daring raid meant you could return home dripping in glory, instantly upgrading your social rank.
But why was the rest of Europe so incredibly ripe for the taking? Well, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you had this massive geopolitical vacuum. Places like England were totally fractured into the heptarchy, 7 kingdoms constantly at war with each other, totally unable to mount a united defense. Combine that with incredibly soft targets. Wealthy Christian monasteries, like Lindisfarne and Iona, were intentionally built on remote, isolated coastlines. So to the Norse, arriving in these highly agile, shallow-draft longships, these undefended storehouses of silver and gold were practically sitting ducks.
And they were smart about it. Over time, the Norse realized they could completely optimize this European vulnerability through strategic evolution. They started out with basic hit-and-run pillaging, but soon they realized it was far more profitable to just extort massive protection payments, known as damgeld, from panicked rulers. It's basically a medieval protection racket. Ultimately, this evolved into them just establishing permanent commercial and political hubs of their own, setting up major cities like Jorvik in York and Dublin in Ireland.
Next up, Section 5. Let's introduce a complicating factor into the mix: ideology, friction, and the religious clash.
Now, as historians, it's vital to impartially report on the historiographical theory that this expansion wasn't purely an economic hunt for land and silver. There was intense religious friction at play, too. Aggressive Christian missionaries were actively pushing into Scandinavia, and you had consolidating kings like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark forcing top-down conversions. Understandably, this generated deep resentment among Norse pagans. So some historians actually argue that targeting those sacred spaces, the Christian monasteries, might have been an intentional ideological pushback against this encroachment, basically an act of religious retaliation rather than just a simple hunt for gold.
Which brings us to the climax of our explainer, Section 6, evaluating significance and weighing the evidence. For those IBDP students listening, this is exactly where you earn those top-tier marks. You got to evaluate and prioritize these factors.
Look, you can't just call everything the primary catalyst, right? That completely defeats the purpose of the analysis. So let's model a hypothetical historian's ranking of these push factors. They might rate land pressures as a highly significant level 4, because, well, the threat of starvation is very real. Politics might come in at a level 3. Super important for elites fleeing the crown, but maybe a bit less pressing for your average commoner. But social status? The desperate need to prove oneself in a hyper-competitive gift exchange economy? You could strongly argue that as a level 5 primary catalyst, driving all those young men overseas to make a name for themselves.
And when we weigh the external pull factors, the picture gets even more complex. Bride shortages might sit at a level 3, a really solid demographic push. The slave trade, however, is massively lucrative. It's basically foundational to the Norse economy, so let's give that a level 4. Religion, while it is a fascinating lens for understanding why monasteries were targeted, might only be a level 2 in the grand scheme of things. It likely operated more as a secondary justification rather than the absolute root cause for a massive global expansion.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that historical causation is immensely, beautifully complex. There is almost never just one single, isolated trigger. The Norse expansion was driven by this incredibly fluid, inseparable combination. It was Scandinavian structural crises, the internal push, meeting European vulnerabilities, the external pull. They intersected perfectly to launch the Norse Age.
And now, I'm throwing it over to you to weigh the evidence. Looking at the brutal land shortages, the tyrannical kings, the demographic broad shortages, those vulnerable monasteries, the booming slave trade, and the religious friction, which factor would you argue was the absolute primary catalyst for Norse expansion?
Take these concepts, build your own historiographical argument, and whatever you do, keep questioning the past. Thanks so much for joining me today.